Hello, it's July 25th and this is the New Arab Weekly podcast from the New Arab in London. Each week we look at the biggest stories from the week and ask what happened and what does it all mean. Joining us to unpack the last 7 days in the Middle East, we have senior journalist and editor Nadda Osman.
Hello.
And news and features associate editor Zainab Mehdi.
Hello.
I was benevolent and good, misery made me a fiend, make me happy, and I shall again be the news. On with the show. Our first story this week is from you, Nadda.
On Friday, the International Court of Justice delivered a damning verdict which detailed how Israel's activities in Palestinian territories are unlawful and in some cases that predated the ongoing war in Gaza. The verdict rejects any argument or justification that Israel has sovereignty over the territories and states that Israel has imposed a regime of apartheid and discrimination. Delivering the verdict on 19th of July, Nawaf Salem, the presiding judge at the ICJ, said this.
Israeli settlements in the West Bank and East Jerusalem and the regime associated with them have been established and are being maintained in violation of international law. The court notes, with grave concern, a report that Israel's settlement policy has been expanding since the court's fall advisory opinion.
Nadda, this all sounds like a very important investigation from the ICJ. Sort of broadly, what were they investigating and what would we say the most notable findings were?
So this was a 90-page probe into Israel's presence in Palestinian territory, where a non-binding advisory opinion issued by a 15-judge panel concluded that Israel's presence in the occupied Palestinian territories should come to an end as rapidly as possible. So firstly, the investigation made clear that Palestine existed before Israeli occupation and that Israel's entire occupation is illegal and should be reversed. Now, this all sounds very obvious, but it is significant because Israeli leaders for a long time have argued that Palestinian territories are not occupied in legal terms because they're disputed. But this ICJ verdict now clarifies that this land was Palestinian, which Israel is occupying. The court also ruled that Israel has imposed a regime of apartheid in the occupied Palestinian territories through systematic discrimination. It called it illegal and a war crime for an occupying power to transfer its population to occupied territory, which Israel is doing through settlements. There's quite a few other key things as well. For example, it mentions that Israel has occupied the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem since the 1967 war. It's built settlements there, which have expanded over time. There's been thousands. So in essence, this verdict has ended this kind of legal debate that has gone on for a long time over whether Israel is entitled to claim the right of self-defense against Palestinians and whether their acts are lawful. Essentially, it's said everything that Palestinians have been saying for a very, very long time.
I think it's interesting that they used apartheid, the term apartheid. It's a legal definition. Since the South African apartheid, it's been a legal definition. So we've heard it before. Amnesty have said it's apartheid. Human Rights Watch have said it's apartheid. And B'Tselem, the Israeli human rights organization, they've said it's apartheid. So I feel like it coming from the ICJ and not a sort of international human rights or even a national human rights organization seems significant. Yeah,
you're right. I mean, people have been debating, how much does this mean, this ICJ verdict? But it does carry some weight to it because, like you said, it's been a conversation that's been happening for a very long time. But now specifically that words such as unlawful, apartheid, discrimination, and all of this has kind of come up. It definitely is significant.
Did they make any recommendations following this?
Yeah, actually, they made quite a few. They said that Israel should pay reparations to Palestinians for damages caused by the occupation. They also demanded that the UN and its member states look into additional measures that they can take to end Israel's unlawful presence in the occupied Palestinian territories. they also highlighted the obligation of other states to not aid or assist in maintaining Israel's presence there. So this is such things such as arms sales to Israel. Now, it's worth mentioning here that the US alone has sent around $6.5 billion worth of security assistance to Israel since the 7th of October.
That's a lot.
That is a lot. So, it's not clear whether all of these things are going to happen. Probably not. But these are recommendations. And like I said, they do carry some kind of significance to them.
Reaction to this. Let's maybe start with probably the most predictable. What was the Israeli reaction?
I mean, there's no surprise here. Netanyahu called the court ruling absurd, saying that Jews have a right to settle in their homeland. He also said that the ICJ had made a decision of lies. Ben Gvir, also the far-right minister who, worth noting, is himself a settler, called the ICJ blatantly anti-Semitic and a political organisation.
All the classics.
Yeah.
Palestinian reaction, what do they have to say about it?
So it was actually quite a varied reaction from Palestinians. The presidency said it renews hope among our people for future free from colonization. The foreign ministry also called it a watershed moment. But Palestinians on the ground, again, it was quite mixed. Some said, and this is a quote, that they couldn't care less since it's more talk about what they've been saying for decades. Many are questioning why this was even up for debate in the first place when, why did it even need an investigation when the death toll in Gaza is close to 40,000 people? But some viewed it in a more hopeful lens, and they said that this will set the narrative straight, and it will make it clear that Palestinians do have the right to defend themselves since it is their land, and it might even embarrass some Arab states who are trying to normalize ties with Israel.
Let's hope so. Anybody else? Did anybody else around the world have anything to say about this?
I mean, I think it's clear that, the rights organizations, like you said, Amnesty and Human Rights Watch, they obviously kind of applauded this ICJ verdict. But I do want to shed some light on the US reaction, which was quite interesting. The US said that their government has long agreed that Israeli settlements are illegal, but the breadth of the court's ruling will complicate efforts to resolve the conflict because it doesn't take into account Israel's security needs. Now, in my opinion, that's quite an irrelevant comment to make because none of what the court was discussing or none of what they brought up, for example, settlements or demolishing homes or theft of Palestinian resources, has anything to do with Israeli security. And it's like one point is really, really interesting as well. It seems like Israeli settlements, which are in the heart of Palestinian territories, actually weaken Israeli security. And there's one theory which suggests that Israeli forces were so ill-prepared on the 7th of October because their attention was diverted elsewhere, and that was to Israeli settler attacks and land grabs in Palestinian territories.
It's nice that, the US will sort of confirm they've long agreed that settlements are illegal. It would have been nicer if they maybe had done something about it over that long period. Okay. It seems like a significant investigation or a significant ruling from the ICJ. They've obviously made these recommendations, reparations, ending of arms sales, etc. What are the enforcement mechanisms to this? I heard you say earlier the word non-binding, which sends a sort of chill down the spine. So what are the enforcement mechanisms here? And, is this going to improve the lives of Palestinians?
Well, that's the question on everyone's mind at the moment. Like I mentioned, the court's ruling is only advisory and not binding because it was requested by the UN General Assembly rather than being a product of a lawsuit between two states. Now, the next stage is for this advisory opinion to return to the body, which will determine or decide how to proceed in the matter. In terms of what this means for Palestinians, we've seen Israel continually ignore previous ICJ decisions in the last few months with them quite literally, bombing UN shelters where Palestinians are sheltering and kind of carrying out airstrikes in densely populated areas. So I don't think that this is going to mean an immediate, ceasefire or halt to attacks. we've also seen Israeli leaders explicitly saying that they're going to defy ICJ orders. So, like I said,
it's like the provisional orders they had with the Gaza, with the war in Gaza, where they said, "Oh, you got to stop." And I remember everyone saying that, if they don't, then they can go back to the ICJ, and the ICJ say you're, breaking these provisional orders, and then the next step for them is to send it to the UN Security Council to rule on it. And who sits on the UN Security Council? The US, who will veto anything to do with Israel.
Yeah, that's correct.
It's a sorry state of affairs.
Yeah.
Zainab, you had a question.
So Nadda, I just want to go back to your point about the ICJ refuting Israel's claim that the West Bank, East Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip are merely disputed rather than occupied territories. For years, the Israeli government has long argued that there was no recognized state of Palestine. Could you talk more about the evidence that Israel has provided for this claim and why this evidence contradicts the actual situation?
So there's no actual real hard evidence, and that's why Israel is relying on and keep repeating this term disputed territory, which is what they've used as a justification to occupy land. The Israelis cite this biblical belief that God promised Palestine to the Jews, and they build and expand settlements there to strengthen this claim to the land. Netanyahu even said after the ICJ verdict that Israelis and Jews can't be occupiers in their own land and that Jerusalem is their capital, something which has been entirely rejected by the international community.
It would be really nice if God could weigh in on this, but I don't think he's going to. Second story is from me this week. The Houthi rebels in Yemen claimed responsibility for a drone attack that hit Tel Aviv on Friday, July 19th, killing one person. In response, Israel conducted airstrikes in Yemen, hitting the port of Hodeida. Speaking on Sunday, July 21st, the day after the Israeli strike, Abdul Malik al-Houthi, the leader of the Houthis, said this: The Israeli enemy will not be able to regain its capability to deter our country's support operations in favor of the Palestinian people. This will lead to further escalation, more attacks targeting the Israeli enemy, and the development of capabilities and abilities adapting to the level of challenge.
So Hugo, what did the Houthis do exactly? What did they target? Did they hit their targets? And talk more about the scale of the damage.
So this was a drone attack. This is something that Houthis have done before, using drones, that is. Predominantly, they've used them against ships in the Red Sea. Much publicised attacks, Houthi attacks in the Red Sea against the shipping lanes, commercial ships. As they sort of, as the leader of the Houthis sort of alluded to in his statement, this was all part of their solidarity sort of campaign with Gaza and with the Palestinian people. The drone landed in Tel Aviv around 3 a.m. Israel time. There was reports of a very powerful explosion. One dead, a civilian he was reported that he died from shrapnel wounds. There were 4 others taken to hospital, relatively minor injuries. The Israeli army said that the blast was, quote, caused by the falling of an aerial target. A military officer, a military official later told reporters, this is a technical language here, that a, quote, very big drone was responsible. The drone strike hit part of Tel Aviv near the US embassy. Whether that was the actual target or not, or what even the specific target was, is quite difficult to say, really. This isn't the first time that the Houthis attacked Israel. They have attacked before, but all these previous attacks have been on Eilat, which is the Gulf of Aqaba, which is the very southern point of Israel. Any further south and you're in the sea. It is as south as it gets, and by nature then the closest point to Yemen. Tel Aviv for them is the furthest they've reached into Israel.
Now, I'm sure this was a huge shock to Israel. What was their response?
Airstrikes. I mean, a classic Israeli response, really. The next day, July 20th, they launched airstrikes. They attacked the Houthi-controlled Yemeni port of Hodeida. Without going into too much detail about the situation in Yemen, the Houthis control the port of Hodeida, but they don't control all ports in Yemen, or not even all of Yemen. But they do control the port of Hodeida, which is important, particularly for oil.
For aid as well, worth mentioning.
And for aid as well, that is important. By all reports, what was hit were oil tanks, which caused a massive fire, burned for at least into Monday, perhaps even longer, and also a power plant as well. 6 people were killed, it was reported, in the attack. A further 80 were wounded, many with severe burns. According to reports, which difficult to confirm, all of those killed and many of those who were wounded were port employees. Mm-hmm. They weren't these, according to reports, were not hardened Houthi fighters. The Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant said, quote, "The blood of Israeli citizens has a price," adding that more operations against the Houthis would follow if they dare to attack us. An Israeli rear admiral accused the Houthis of using Hodeida as a main supply route for the transfer of Iranian weapons, like the drone that was used, which I think is why that was the sort of reasoning behind choosing the port of Hodeida as their target.
I'm actually curious about any sort of regional response, if you could elaborate on that as well.
Yeah, there was nothing sort of major in the regional sort of response way. There were a couple of interesting responses, namely from Egypt and Saudi Arabia, who have both been part in the past of anti-Houthi campaigns. Saudi Arabia, probably most prominently, got all tied up in the sort of Yemeni civil war and a campaign against the Houthis, which was, considering the Houthis are still there, ultimately unsuccessful. But Egypt said that, quote, "it was deep concern regarding the Israeli military actions in Yemen, warning that these actions threatened to intensify tensions across multiple fronts." They sort of called for international efforts to ensure regional security and stability. Saudi Arabia, on Sunday, they denied they had anything to do with the Israeli airstrikes. They said, quote, "the kingdom has no relation or involvement in the targeting of Hodeida, and the kingdom will not allow any entity to violate its airspace." That was a spokesman for the Ministry of Defense, Saudi Arabia. Iran, they came out with the usual stuff. They condemned Israel, quote, "the Zionist Israeli regime aggression on the Hodeida port city in Yemen." Early in the day, they condemned it. I think it was interesting that Saudi Arabia and Egypt find themselves in a difficult situation where they don't like the Houthis and they don't support the Houthis. They probably don't like the idea of the Houthis attacking Israel because it just doesn't help the region. But to come out and celebrate or praise Israel for conducting a campaign against a group that are, vocally in support of Palestine is a bad move for the government. Yeah. So I think they have to tread a very...
puts them in a difficult position.
It puts them in a very difficult position, I think.
I'm most surprised about the fact that the Houthis could fly a drone from Yemen to Israel without it being detected or shot down. So what exactly went wrong with Israel or Western air defenses here?
Yeah, it is astounding. I mean, to put it in context, the distance from Tel Aviv to Yemen is 1,800 kilometers. That's 1,120 miles. Is a long way. In brief, throughout the civil war in Yemen, the weapons capabilities of the Houthis has increased greatly. I mean, mainly because they get all their weapons supplied from Iran. The drone that they used, it seemed to be a new type of drone for them. They called it the Yafa, named after the old, the name for Tel Aviv before the Israeli occupation. They claimed that this new drone was capable of bypassing Israel's interception systems. They also claimed that they manufacture the drone domestically. Well, the international assumption, which is, say, sort of the US and Saudi Arabia say that the drones come from Iran, that's probably right, I would say. I think the domestic probably part of it is, I think the drones probably come to Yemen and the Houthis in parts from Iran,
assembled,
and they just assemble them in Yemen. I mean, it doesn't essentially make them Yemeni drones. That's a question of semantics. That's sort of what the Houthis are saying great new drone and it can get past air defences. The Israeli military sort of counterclaim to this was a military official spoke to the Times of Israel anonymously and said that a, quote, another, quote, very big drone had been detected by them, but the alarm was not raised because of, again, quote, human error. So
I'm sure that caused a lot of kind of, dissatisfaction and questions, especially after the failings of 7th of October.
If it's true.
Yeah.
Right. I think this is there is technology available to the Houthis which would allow them to attack or give them the potential to attack Israel, right? They could have bigger engines on drones, right? Which would essentially mean they can travel much further distances and allow them to sort of circumnavigate around Israeli detection, rather than going just one straight line. They can sort of loop around. And they can also sort of come from, unexpected angles, which will help them out. They do also, they could also be using radar absorbent materials, which would prevent or make them a lot less visible, if not invisible. So, was it Israel and human error and they let it through, or are
Houthis just advanced?
Are the Houthis actually advanced?
Yeah.
I am not calling. I want to stress, I'm not calling for the Houthis to launch another drone attack against civilians in Israel. But we probably actually won't know the truth of this until they try again. If they can achieve it again and repeat the results, like in a science experiment, if they can repeat the results, then the balance of probability says that Houthis got some really good drones. If they get shot down, right on the Israeli border or somewhere over the Mediterranean or wherever, then the sort of Israeli idea of a human error story probably makes a bit more sense.
And just looking towards the future, can we expect the Houthis to launch an expanded drone campaign against Israel?
Difficult to say, really, I think. I mean, as I mentioned, it's difficult to know whether they either A, will repeat this, or B, can even repeat this. I would you would think that for the Houthis, they would consider the attack on Tel Aviv to be a massive success. I would think.
They also did put out a statement to say that they are going to start changing their strategy. So that's also interesting.
Yeah. So, whether they'll continue with this or change it or, I think it is difficult to say. I would also say a drone landing in Tel Aviv, it killed a civilian, which is not great, but it does not represent a huge threat to Israel. I mean, it's not the biggest thing in the world. For it to be a genuine threat to Israel, they would need a much bigger drone, which would make it a lot easier for the Israelis to spot and then shoot down, or a sort of vast swarm of drones, which again, can be spotted and can be shot down. I mean, the problem is it's a huge distance for these drones to travel from Yemen to Israel. So to do such an attack on a scale that would be a genuine threat to Israel is difficult. The one thing that the Houthis have got on their side is they're only, all they got to do is be lucky and have one slip through. That's all that's got to happen.
Well, Israel is obviously much more alert to this now as well.
They are a lot more alert to it, so that's going to make it more difficult. But there was that old, IRA mantra from the Troubles when they said, we've only got to be lucky once, and you've got to be lucky every single time. Well, the same is true with the Houthis and drones. They've only got to get one through, and then that's success for them. We'll see what happens going forward. Final story. Zainab, that's you.
So on Thursday, July 24th, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu addressed the US Congress. He expressed his appreciation for the ongoing US support of Israel's war against Gaza and criticized anti-war protesters. While many in Congress applauded the Prime Minister's speech, others, including protesters, took to the streets and exposed his genocidal crimes. He provided few details on ceasefire negotiations, but called for a total victory and warned of a threat coming from Iran.
We meet today at a crossroads of history. Our world is in upheaval. In the Middle East, Iran's axis of terror confronts America, Israel, and our Arab friends. This is not a clash of civilizations. It's a clash between barbarism and civilization.
Zainab, big speech. What did he say? What were the most notable points from the speech?
So, as I mentioned, he called for a total victory in the 9-month-old war, and as usual, he spoke very little about a ceasefire and the return of Israeli hostages. He also spoke of the growing Iranian threat and said that Iran was the axis of terror behind almost all sectarian killing in the Middle East. He argued that the United States and Israel must stand together against Tehran and its proxies. In his own words, he said, "We're not only protecting ourselves, we're protecting you. Our enemies are your enemy, our fight is your fight, and our victory will be your victory." Right after making this statement, House and Senate Republicans rose to their feet to applaud the Israeli Prime Minister, and to be specific, this speech was interrupted 39 times for claps to be made.
For applause?
Yeah.
Wow. That is... I'm watching all the footage of when he came in and they were all applauding him and sort of patting him on the back and shaking his hand.
It's yeah.
It made me feel quite ill.
Social media is full of this kind of split image video of the standing ovation for him versus what's the reality of what's happening in Gaza, which was so shocking.
Yeah, it was quite sickening.
And just touching on your point, Nadda, he also brushed aside humanitarian concerns for the civilian population of Gaza, denying that Israel was blocking shipments to food aid to Palestinians and issuing an appeal for the US to fast-track military aid to Israel. And also, I just want to go back to my point about Iran. He also addressed the anti-war college protesters, calling them Iran's useful idiots. And finally, he made a statement about those who were engaging in these protests and saying, he said, many anti-Israel protesters choose to stand with evil and many stand with Hamas.
All the classics from Netanyahu. What was the response from Congress? Was there any dissent amid all that applause? And I'm sure I read about sort of counter events that were happening. What were those?
So the response was mixed. His speech was met with both political backlash and also support. So as I mentioned before, he received 39 claps and he was also given a standing ovation. At the same time, however, dozens of Democratic members of Congress, including the former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, said that they would boycott the speech over humanitarian concerns about how Israel has prosecuted the war in Gaza, which has left an estimated 39,000 Palestinian civilians dead. Axios also reported that nearly half of all Democratic lawmakers were absent from the joint session. Also, Rashida Tlaib, the only Palestinian American member of Congress, wore her kafaya proudly and held up a black and white sign that read "war criminal" and "guilty of genocide" throughout the entire speech.
Didn't she go there also with a Palestinian man from Gaza who 150 members of his family and relatives were killed, and he actually attended with her?
Yes, exactly.
That's a far better guest than Elon Musk, who was also there.
Yeah.
Any counter events?
So, counter events. Ahead of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's speech to Congress, there was a major protest on Capitol Hill on Tuesday. Hundreds of American Jewish activists were arrested after they demonstrated against US military support for Israel and called for a ceasefire in Gaza. This protest took place just a day before his speech. The Capitol Police reported that around 200 people were arrested for protesting inside a congressional building, which is illegal, apparently. Protesters had been warned beforehand about the rules. Just one final note. Yep. The demonstration was organized by the Jewish Voice for Peace, an advocacy group that opposes the Israeli occupation of Palestinian land and promotes a vision of Judaism beyond Zionism. On the day of the actual speech, police used pepper spray on protesters outside the Capitol who were chanting, "Netanyahu, you can't hide, you're committing genocide." Traffic was blocked off and officers with experience in handling large protests were brought in from New York.
It's funny because Netanyahu in his speech referred to it as a small protest. He said just a handful of people, which is so...
a very big handful.
It was a huge handful.
Yeah.
I don't know how big his hands are, but that's a lot of people that were protesting outside and have been for a while. And I think it's also worth noting that, the US House Speaker last week came out and said that any disruption or protest would face arrest. Yeah. And they also heightened security and heightened the amount of, increased the amount of police present.
We can't avoid it. The other big story for the week, the average age of presidential candidates dropped when Joe Biden stepped aside and Kamala Harris became the presumptive Democrat nominee. Big news, seems to have really shaken up the race for president. What, in regards to Kamala Harris, what do we know about her stance on the Middle East? If she does win, it's going to be a big issue for her to deal with. So,
well, what we do know so far, Harris has consistently supported Israel. Even before the recent escalation with Hamas on October 7th, she was vocal about standing with Israel. We also shouldn't forget that her husband is Jewish as well. In 2017, for example, she spoke at a AIPAC conference emphasizing her commitment to Israel's right to self-defense and military cooperation between the two nations. She's also reaffirmed her support for a two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. That said, she has also looked at the other side and has been vocal about the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, calling on Israel to better protect civilians and to address the humanitarian situation more effectively. Earlier this year, she attended the Munich Security Conference, and Harris made it clear that while the US supports Israel, it also expects Israel to take measures to prevent civilian casualties. Furthermore, she's criticized the high death toll and urged Israel to avoid further humanitarian disasters like in Rafah. Looking beyond the Gaza conflict, Harris is also dealing with other regional issues. She's been in touch with Jordan's King Abdullah II to address violence in Jerusalem and the West Bank. She's also tackled climate crisis concerns in the region and is also working on promoting stability in Iraq. I also just want to touch on Iran here as well. She's also condemned Trump's withdrawal from the nuclear deal with Iran in 2018, calling it reckless. During her presidential campaign in 2019, she said she would have the US rejoin the agreement and ensure verifiable compliance for Iran's nuclear program.
Nadda, you had a question for Zainab.
Yeah, so Netanyahu repeated a number of claims about what happened on the 7th of October. Some of them included, beheadings and babies burned alive. Has there been any sort of evidence or investigations that support his claims?
Since October 7th, investigations have found that while Hamas have committed atrocities against civilians, little evidence has emerged to confirm some of the most horrific stories pushed by Israeli leaders such as Netanyahu. One investigation that was carried out includes Al Jazeera's investigative unit carried out a forensic analysis of the events of October 7th. The investigation, which examined hours of footage from CCTV, dash cams, personal phones and head cams of killed Hamas fighters found that many of the stories that came out in the days following the attack were false. These include the claims of atrocities such as the mass killing and beheading of babies, as well as allegations of systematic rape. So just to kind of sum up and answer your question very briefly, very little evidence has come through.
A few other stories from the week. We got one here. Came out today. EU member states seek normalization with Syria's Assad. 8 member states of the European Union have called on the bloc to, quote, review and assess its policy towards Syria in a letter sent to the EU's chief diplomat, Joseph Borrell. The signatories are Austria, Croatia, Cyprus, the Czech Republic, Greece, Italy, Slovakia, and Slovenia. They suggested that the EU should take a more lenient approach to the regime of President Bashar al-Assad. One of the things they're saying is this will help get in more aid to Syria. I mean, if that is the case, is this a good thing?
I don't think any lenient approach to Assad's regime is a positive thing. I think it will only normalise and in turn worsen the atrocities being carried out in Syria. But I guess this could be helpful in making EU countries maybe slightly less hostile to Syrian refugees. And obviously aid is a priority.
Yep, certainly. I think it's always important to remember when it comes to Syria that appalling atrocities have been committed in the past, and they also continue to this day. Second story, US announces Sudan ceasefire talks. The United States announced on Tuesday that it had invited Sudan's warring sides to hold ceasefire talks in Switzerland next month. Secretary of State Antony Blinken said Washington had invited Sudan's army and the paramilitary rapid support forces to start US-mediated negotiations beginning August 14th. This seems like excellent news. Sudan, I feel ever sorry for Sudan for perhaps having the war at the wrong time, because it really doesn't get the airtime it deserves. Are we hopeful? Do we think that maybe something good can come of this?
I think there is hope, especially since the war is now being recognised as the world's worst humanitarian crisis. Images are coming through of all of the atrocities being committed in Sudan, so I am hopeful.
Yeah. Final story. Pro-Palestine Bella Hadid to sue Adidas after acts for 1972 Olympic shoe ad. American Palestinian model Bella Hadid is reportedly suing shoe and sportswear brand Adidas after being dropped from one of its campaigns. Sources familiar with the situation told American tabloid TMZ that the model had hired legal counsel to sue Adidas for their lack of public accountability. She was going to be the face of a shoe, and then Israel complained, and now she's not. And now she says she's going to sue them.
Yep.
I mean, the solidarity with, particularly with Gaza and sort of the wider Palestinian cause, is pretty popular amongst the young, who I'm reliably informed by trainers and this sorts of thing, and like models like Bella Hadid. I think she's popular amongst the youth. This seems like, is this a mistake for Adidas to sort of, let's be honest, cave into Israeli pressure?
Absolutely. I mean, I think Adidas was very quick to respond to baseless allegations from mainly Zionist groups and public figures online, let's be honest, if you have a scroll through X. But also it's worth noting that Bella Hadid was born long after the 1972 Munich Olympics, where 11 Israelis were killed.
Because I think that was their main sort of point of anger with it all.
But also, I think this is also probably slightly racist, because it suggests that every Palestinian is to blame for any attack on Israelis. I think Adidas should have responded in a better and more measured way to what clearly is a hate campaign.
Yeah.
I agree with you completely, Nadda. You know, Bella Hadid is not affiliated with terrorism, and terrorism does not align with her values or the incidents that took place in 1972, so it's a big, big mistake.
Over to you, Adidas. Some really good stuff on the New Arab's website this week. Nadda, you've picked out something.
Yes, mine is from the news section. It's from our West Bank writer, Fayhat, and it's titled Family Remembers Mohammed, Gaza man with Down syndrome left to die by Israeli forces. Now, a lot of our listeners would already have heard about this. The young 24-year-old man who was mauled by dogs and his body left to decompose for a week. In this story, our writer interviews the mother and the siblings, and I think it's quite a humanizing story because often we just see, all of these headlines and, we move on to the next thing a week later or a day later. But she speaks about what he enjoyed as a child and his relationship with his siblings. They described him as the blessing of the house. It is quite a sad story, but it's well worth a read.
Yeah. Well worth a read, I agree. I picked out from our analysis section, could the Nile Dam dispute between Egypt and Ethiopia escalate? This is about the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. It's written by Amar Imam. The GERD is preparing to make its fifth and final filling by the end of July. It's a huge project. It's been going on for a long time, and the tensions and diplomatic wranglings between the two countries have been pretty intense. If you want to know more about it, it's a good read. Zainab, what have you got?
My recommendation is from the features desk. It's a book feature on Sinan Antoun, an Iraqi novelist, translator, poet, and NYU protester who reflects on his 4-hour arrest in April this year during pro-Palestine protests in New York and his recent translation of Palestinian stories, including The Book of Disappearance by Ibtisam Azam, a Palestinian novelist, short story writer, and journalist based in New York. The translation has already been released in the US and it's coming out in the UK on the 1st of August.
All those and many more on the New Arab's website and well worth a read. Thank you for joining us for this episode of the New Arab Weekly. This week we were joined by senior journalist and editor Nadda Osman and news and features associate editor Zainab Mehdi. The New Arab Weekly is taking a summer holiday, but the New Arab Voice, our other podcast, is returning shortly, so keep an eye on your feeds. You can subscribe to the New Arab Weekly and the New Arab Voice on Apple and Spotify and wherever else you get your podcasts and be notified when a new episode drops. You can also rate and review, which helps us spread the word. Until then, if you have any questions for us or stories that you would like us to cover, drop us an email, podcast@newarab.com. That's podcast@newarab.com, or find us on social media @TNA Podcasts for all the latest news. Don't forget to follow the New Arab on Facebook, X, and Instagram for all the latest news, analysis, and opinion from the region